The invisible confrontation. What do you do when your faith is still in your words, but no longer alive inside you? When you kneel to pray, but your mind is louder than your belief? When your lips move, but your heart does not follow? There is no peace, no certainty, no sense of connection, only effort, only repetition, only a quiet discomfort that grows every time you try to convince yourself that everything is still the same. This is the moment most people hide, even from themselves, because it is easier to pretend than to confront what is really happening inside. You keep showing up, you keep saying the right things, you keep maintaining the image of someone who believes, but something has changed, and you feel it. You feel it in the silence after your prayers. You feel it in the emptiness that follows your attempts to trust. You feel it in the subtle fear that maybe you are drifting away and do not know how to stop it. And the most unsettling part is not the doubt itself. It is the fact that you never expected to feel this way. You were taught that faith would bring stability, clarity, strength. But now you are here, in a place where none of that seems real. And instead of strength, you feel fragile. Instead of clarity, you feel confused. Instead of certainty, you feel a constant internal tension that does not go away. So you begin to question quietly. Not in conversations, not in public, but within your own mind. Is something wrong with me? Did I do something to deserve this distance? Why does it feel like God is silent when I need Him the most? Why does it feel like I am the only one going through this while everyone else seems so sure? And without realizing it, you start creating a dangerous conclusion, that your faith is fading, that you are losing something essential, that this internal struggle is proof that you are becoming weaker, not stronger. You begin to measure yourself against a version of faith that once felt easy and now feels impossible to reach again. But there is something you need to understand before you go any further. This moment you are experiencing is not new. It has happened to those who came before you, to those who built unshakable faith, not in comfort, but in confrontation. In Meditations Book 2, paragraph 1 of Marcus Aurelius, he reminds himself that difficulty is not an interruption of the path, it is the path itself. And what you are facing now is not outside the journey of faith, it is at the center of it. The problem is that no one prepared you for this phase. No one told you that there would be a moment where faith would stop feeling natural and start requiring intention, where belief would no longer be supported by emotion, but sustained by choice, where the silence would test not what you say you believe, but what you are willing to hold on to when nothing confirms it. And this is where most people break. Not because they lack faith, but because they misunderstand what is happening to them. They interpret this silence as absence. They interpret this struggle as failure. They interpret this discomfort as a sign that something is wrong. But what if the opposite is true? What if this is the moment where your faith is being stripped of everything that made it weak? Everything that depended on feelings, on external reassurance, on circumstances that made belief easy. What if this is where a different kind of faith begins to form? One that does not collapse when life becomes uncertain. Because the truth is, the version of you that believed before cannot carry you through what you are facing now. And the version of faith you had before was never designed for this level of pressure. Something inside you is being confronted, refined, reshaped. And you feel it because it is real. So before you decide that you are losing your faith, consider this. You might be standing at the exact point where your faith stops being something you inherited and starts becoming something you own. And what you choose to do next will determine everything that follows. The feeling of spiritual distance. There is a kind of distance that cannot be measured by space, only by presence. You continue with your routines, you say the same prayers, you read the same words, but something feels disconnected. It is not that you stopped believing, it is that belief no longer feels alive in the same way, and that is what disturbs you. Not the absence of action, but the absence of response. You expect something to happen, a sense of peace, a sign, a confirmation that you are still being heard. But what you receive instead is silence. Not a calm silence, but a heavy one. A silence that forces you to sit with your own thoughts, your own doubts, your own questions that grow louder the longer nothing answers them. And this is where confusion begins to take shape, because you were taught that if you seek, you will find, that if you ask, it will be given. But now you are seeking and you feel nothing. You are asking and there is no visible answer, and your mind starts to create interpretations. Maybe I am doing something wrong. Maybe I am not worthy. Maybe I am not as faithful as I thought I was. This internal dialogue does not happen all at once. It builds slowly, almost imperceptibly. One unanswered prayer becomes two. One moment of doubt becomes a pattern of questioning. And before you realize it, the distance you feel is no longer just emotional. It becomes existential. You start wondering not only where God is, but where you stand in relation to Him. And the most isolating part of this experience is that you believe you are alone in it. You look around and see people who seem confident, grounded, certain. You hear their words, their testimonies, their convictions, and you compare that to your internal state, which feels unstable, uncertain, fragile. And instead of reaching out, you withdraw. Because it feels safer to struggle in silence than to admit that your faith does not feel as strong as it once did. But there is something critical you need to understand. What you are experiencing is not abandonment. It is not rejection. It is not the absence of God. It is the removal of what once sustained you so that something deeper can take its place. In Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis describes how faith is not about maintaining a constant emotional state, but about holding on to what you once knew to be true, even when your feelings change. And this is where that idea becomes real, because now you are no longer supported by emotion. You are confronted with a choice: to continue without feeling, or to stop because you no longer feel. This distance you perceive is not proof that you are being left behind. It is proof that you are being invited to move beyond a surface-level experience. The problem is that this invitation does not feel like growth. It feels like loss, and that is why so many people turn back at this point. They mistake this transition for failure. They assume that because the connection no longer feels immediate, it no longer exists. They interpret silence as absence, when in reality, silence is often the environment where the deepest transformation begins. Think about it. Noise gives you comfort, but silence reveals you. And what is being revealed right now is not weakness. It is everything in your faith that was dependent on external reinforcement. Everything that needed constant reassurance to survive. Now you are being asked to stand without that. And it is uncomfortable. It is unfamiliar. It feels like something is missing. But what is actually happening is that something is being rebuilt in a way that does not rely on what you feel in the moment, but on what you choose to hold on to despite the moment. So the question is no longer whether you feel close. The question is whether you are willing to remain, even when you do not. Because what comes next depends entirely on that decision, the truth that contradicts everything you expected. You were led to believe that faith would protect you from collapse. That if you believed enough, trusted enough, stayed consistent enough, life would respond with clarity, direction, and a sense of order. But now you are standing in the middle of uncertainty, doing everything you were taught to do, and nothing seems to respond the way you expected. And this is where a difficult truth begins to surface. Faith was never designed to make life easier. It was designed to reveal what is real when life becomes difficult. It does not eliminate pressure. It exposes what can withstand it. Most people misunderstand this, and that misunderstanding is what breaks them. They assume that if they feel lost, something is wrong with their faith. But what if the opposite is true? What if this moment is not exposing weakness, but stripping away illusion? Because there is a version of faith that exists only when conditions are favorable, a version that depends on understanding, on emotional confirmation, on visible outcomes, and that version feels strong as long as life cooperates. But the moment life stops aligning with expectations, that same faith begins to fracture. Not because faith itself is fragile, but because it was never built on something solid. In The Problem of Pain, C.S. Lewis explains that pain insists upon being attended to. It forces you to confront what you would otherwise ignore. And that is exactly what is happening now. The discomfort you feel is not random. It is demanding your attention, not to break you, but to show you what your faith has been relying on. You are being confronted with a question you cannot avoid. Was your faith built on truth, or was it built on comfort? This is not a comfortable question, but it is a necessary one, because the answer determines what happens next. If your faith was built on comfort, then this moment will feel like destruction. But if it is rebuilt on truth, then this same moment becomes transformation. And this is where most people turn back. They try to recover the feeling they had before. They chase the same emotional state, the same sense of certainty, the same immediate reassurance. But what they do not realize is that they are trying to return to a version of faith that was never meant to carry them through this level of reality. You cannot go back to that. And more importantly, you are not supposed to. What you are experiencing is not the loss of faith. It is the exposure of everything that could not sustain it. Every assumption, every dependency, every expectation that made your belief conditional is being brought to the surface. And this process feels like loss because it removes what once made you feel secure. But that sense of security was temporary. It was based on things that change, on circumstances that shift, on emotions that cannot be controlled. Now you are being invited into something different. Something that does not depend on whether you feel strong, or whether life makes sense, or whether you can see where you are going. This is where faith stops being a reaction and becomes a position. Not something you do when it feels right, but something you stand on when nothing feels right. And this shift changes everything. Because once your faith is no longer tied to your conditions, it cannot be taken from you by your conditions. But getting to that point requires something most people avoid. It requires accepting that what you expected faith to be was incomplete, that what you relied on before was not enough for where you are now. And that realization is uncomfortable. It challenges your assumptions. It forces you to let go of what felt familiar. But it also opens the door to something far more stable. Because what comes next is not about restoring what you had. It is about building something that cannot be shaken by what you are going through. And that begins with a decision you are about to face. The decision point that changes everything. There is a moment in every internal battle where clarity does not come from answers, but from pressure. A moment where you realize that waiting to feel ready is no longer an option. You are standing in it now, not at the beginning of your struggle, but at the point where something inside you must decide what happens next. Because at this stage, neutrality disappears. You are no longer just experiencing doubt. You are responding to it. And every response, even silence, is shaping who you are becoming. You can feel it. The tension between giving up and holding on. Between stepping back and stepping forward. Between allowing your thoughts to define you or choosing to confront them. And the truth is, no one else can make this decision for you. No explanation, no message, no external reassurance can replace what needs to happen internally right now. This is where most people retreat, not because they lack potential, but because this moment demands something deeper than motivation. It demands responsibility. It demands that you stop waiting for clarity and start acting in the absence of it. And that is uncomfortable, because you were conditioned to move when things make sense, when emotions align, when confidence is present. But now you are being asked to move without those supports, to stand without confirmation, to continue without knowing. This is not natural behavior. It is trained behavior. It is the kind of internal discipline that separates those who collapse under pressure from those who are shaped by it. In Meditations Book 5, paragraph 1 of Marcus Aurelius, he reminds himself that at dawn, when he struggles to rise, he must tell himself that he is rising to do the work of a human being. Not because it feels good, but because it is necessary. And what you are facing now is a similar demand. Not physical, but spiritual. You are being asked to show up without the feeling that once made it easy, to act without the emotional reward that once followed, to continue without the certainty that once guided you. And this is where identity begins to shift, because until now your faith may have been something you experienced. But from this point forward, it becomes something you choose. There is no middle ground here. Either you allow this moment to define your limits, or you use it to redefine your foundation. If you step back, you reinforce the idea that your faith depends on conditions, that when things become unclear, you withdraw, that when feelings fade, you stop. But if you step forward, even without confidence, even without clarity, even without emotional support, you establish something different. You prove to yourself that your faith is not controlled by what you feel, but by what you decide. And that decision, repeated over time, becomes structure. It becomes stability. It becomes something that does not break when pressure increases. But understand this clearly. This is not a dramatic decision. It is not a moment of sudden transformation. It is quiet. It is internal. It happens in the space where no one is watching, where no one is validating you, where no one is guiding you step by step. It is the decision to stay, to remain in the process, to continue seeking even when you do not feel found, to keep standing even when everything inside you suggests stepping away. And once that decision is made, everything that follows begins to change, not because your circumstances immediately improve, but because your position within them becomes stronger. You stop reacting to the moment and start shaping your response to it. And that is where real transformation begins. Because from this point forward, what sustains your faith will no longer be what you feel, but what you are willing to do consistently, regardless of how you feel. And that is exactly what you are about to understand next. The promise that almost no one keeps. There is a promise almost everyone makes in moments of clarity, but very few sustain when pressure arrives. It is the promise to remain consistent, to stay faithful, disciplined, focused, regardless of what happens. It sounds strong when you say it. It feels real when everything is aligned. But the truth is revealed only when that promise is tested by silence, uncertainty, and emotional fatigue. You have made this promise before, not necessarily with words, but with intention. You decided that you would not give up easily, that you would not allow circumstances to define your faith. But now you are in the exact environment where that promise must be honored, and you can feel how different it is from when you first made it. Because intention is easy when it is not challenged. Commitment is proven only when it is. And this is where most people fail, not because they are incapable, but because they underestimate what consistency actually requires. They believe it is about staying motivated, about maintaining a certain emotional state, about feeling connected enough to continue. But consistency has nothing to do with feeling ready. It is built on acting despite not feeling ready. This is where the gap appears. The gap between what you said you would do and what you are actually willing to do when it becomes difficult. And this gap defines everything, not your knowledge, not your beliefs, but your ability to sustain action without emotional support. In the Epistle of James, chapter 1, verses 3 and 4, it is written that the testing of your faith produces perseverance, and perseverance must finish its work so that you may be mature and complete. This is not a poetic idea. It is a process that requires repetition, endurance, and a willingness to continue even when nothing seems to change. What you are experiencing now is that process in real time. And it exposes something uncomfortable, that many of the promises you made were based on how you felt at the time, not on a structure that could support you when feelings changed. You believed you were committed, but in reality, you were motivated. And motivation fades quickly when conditions become unfavorable. So now you are faced with a new understanding. If your faith is going to remain, it cannot depend on how you feel in the moment. It must be anchored in something that does not fluctuate with your emotions. This is where discipline enters, not as a rigid system, but as a form of internal stability. Discipline is what carries you when inspiration disappears. It is what keeps you aligned when your thoughts begin to drift. It is what allows you to continue even when the outcome is not visible. And this is why so few people fulfill the promise they make. Because discipline is quiet. It is repetitive. It does not provide immediate reward. It requires you to show up again and again without confirmation that it is working. But this is exactly where strength is built. Not in moments of emotional intensity, but in moments of silent consistency. When you continue to act in alignment with what you believe, even when you do not feel it. When you maintain your position, even when your mind suggests retreat. This is not about perfection, it is about direction. It is about choosing, repeatedly, to move forward instead of stepping back. And every time you do that, something shifts. Not always externally, but internally. You begin to create a foundation that does not depend on external validation. A structure that remains intact even when everything around you feels unstable. This is the promise that changes everything. Not the promise to feel strong, but the promise to act with strength. Not the promise to always understand, but the promise to continue without understanding. And once you start honoring this, even imperfectly, you begin to realize that faith is not sustained by moments. It is sustained by patterns. And those patterns are what you are about to explore next. The principles that sustain faith when everything falls apart. At this point, you are no longer looking for comfort. You are looking for something that holds. Something that does not collapse when your emotions shift, when your thoughts become unstable, when life refuses to respond the way you expected. Because now you understand that faith is not maintained by what you feel in isolated moments, but by what you repeatedly choose in the middle of pressure. And this is where most people get lost. They search for a single answer, a single breakthrough, a single moment that will restore everything at once. But that is not how this works. Faith is not rebuilt in one moment. It is sustained through a structure, a set of principles that operate whether you feel strong or not, whether you feel connected or not, whether you feel certain or not. These principles are not theoretical. They are not motivational ideas meant to inspire you temporarily. They are functional. They exist to support you when everything else fails. Because what you are facing now is not a lack of belief. It is a lack of structure. Without structure, your faith becomes reactive. It rises when things go well and collapses when they do not. It depends on external conditions, on emotional states, on moments that cannot be controlled, and that kind of faith cannot survive sustained pressure. So what you need is not more emotion. You need alignment. You need internal order. You need a way to stabilize yourself when nothing around you is stable. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 27, the Apostle Paul speaks about disciplining his own body and bringing it under control, so that he is not disqualified after preaching to others. This is not about physical discipline alone. It is about mastery. The ability to direct yourself even when your impulses, your thoughts, and your feelings are pulling you in different directions. And that is exactly what these principles are designed to do. They give you direction when your mind is scattered. They give you stability when your emotions fluctuate. They give you something to stand on when everything else feels uncertain. Because the truth is simple. If you do not govern your internal world will govern you. And when doubt appears, when fear intensifies, when silence continues, your natural reaction will be to withdraw, to question, to disengage. Not because you decided to, but because you were not prepared to respond differently. These principles interrupt that pattern. They create a space between what you feel and what you choose. And in that space, you regain control. You stop being driven by your reactions and start acting with intention. You stop waiting for the right feeling and start creating the right action. You stop depending on what is happening to you and start focusing on how you respond to it. This is where faith becomes practical. Not something abstract, not something distant, but something lived. Something expressed in how you think, how you act, how you remain consistent even when nothing feels aligned. And understand this clearly. These principles will not remove your struggle. They will not eliminate doubt, silence, or difficulty. But they will change your position within them. Instead of being overwhelmed, you become grounded. Instead of being reactive, you become deliberate. Instead of being uncertain about what to do, you have a framework that guides you. And that changes everything. Because once you begin to operate from that place, your faith is no longer fragile. It is no longer dependent on external confirmation. It becomes something stable, something structured, something that does not collapse when pressure increases. And what happens internally as you apply these principles is something most people never talk about. It is subtle. It is quiet, but it is powerful. And it is exactly what you are about to understand next. The inner workings that nobody sees. What is happening inside you right now will not be visible to anyone around you. There is no external sign, no immediate evidence, no clear indicator that something is changing. From the outside, everything may look the same. You are still moving, still speaking, still living your routine. But internally, there is a process unfolding that is far more significant than anything that can be seen. And this is where most people lose perspective, because they are conditioned to measure progress by what they can observe. If nothing changes externally, they assume nothing is happening. If there is no immediate result, they assume the effort is not working, and this mindset becomes dangerous because it leads to abandonment of the process before it has time to take effect. But real transformation does not begin on the surface. It begins in places no one applauds, no one recognizes, no one even notices. It begins in how you respond to a thought you used to follow without question. It begins in how you interrupt a pattern that used to control you. It begins in how you choose to stay when your instinct is to withdraw. These are small shifts, almost imperceptible in the moment, but they are not insignificant. They are foundational. In Romans chapter 12, verse 2, it is written that you are transformed by the renewing of your mind, not by changing your circumstances, not by controlling what happens around you, but by restructuring how you think. And that restructuring does not happen all at once. It happens through repetition, through correction, through awareness. And that is exactly what is taking place inside you. Every time you resist the urge to give up, something strengthens. Every time you choose to continue despite confusion, something stabilizes. Every time you refuse to let your thoughts define your direction, something reorganizes within you. You may not feel it immediately. You may not recognize it as progress, but it is happening. The problem is that this process is silent. It does not announce itself. It does not provide immediate reward. It requires patience, something that most people struggle to maintain when they are already under pressure. So they stop, not because nothing is happening, but because they cannot see what is happening. And that is the difference. Those who continue without visible confirmation develop something that cannot be easily broken, because their persistence is not based on results. It is based on understanding. They understand that growth is not always accompanied by feeling, that transformation is not always accompanied by clarity, that progress is not always accompanied by visible change. They learn to trust the process before the process reveals itself. And that changes the entire dynamic. Because once you stop demanding immediate evidence, you become capable of sustaining long-term change. You stop interrupting your own development by expecting instant results. You allow the internal work to reach a point where it begins to express itself externally, naturally, without force. And when that happens, it feels different. Not like a sudden breakthrough, but like a quiet realization. A realization that you are not reacting the way you used to. That your thoughts no longer have the same control. That your stability is no longer dependent on what is happening around you. And this is where a deeper awareness begins to emerge. You start to see that what felt like stagnation was actually construction. What felt like silence was actually formation. What felt like distance was actually preparation. And once you see that, everything begins to reorganize in your mind, because now you are no longer questioning whether something is happening. You are starting to recognize that something has been happening all along. And that realization is what leads to the moment where everything finally makes sense. The awakening, when everything starts to make sense. There comes a moment when the confusion begins to reorganize itself into clarity, not because everything around you suddenly changes, but because something inside you finally aligns. The questions that once felt heavy start to lose their weight. The silence that once felt empty begins to feel intentional. And what once seemed like disconnection starts to reveal a deeper form of presence. This is not a dramatic breakthrough. It is a quiet awakening. You begin to notice that you are no longer reacting the same way. Situations that once destabilized you no longer carry the same power. Thoughts that once dominated your mind now pass without control. The urgency to feel something, to prove something, to resolve everything immediately starts to fade. And in its place, something steadier begins to form. You start to understand that nothing you experienced was wasted. Every moment of doubt, every unanswered question, every instance of silence was shaping something within you that could not have been formed any other way. This is where perception shifts. You stop asking why this happened to you and begin to understand what it produced in you. You stop measuring your faith by how it feels and begin to recognize it by how it stands. Not when everything is clear, but when nothing is. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 16 through 18, it is written that outwardly you may be wasting away, but inwardly you are being renewed day by day, and that what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. This is no longer just an idea. It becomes a lived reality, because now you see it. You see that the absence of immediate answers forced you to develop patience. You see that the lack of emotional reinforcement pushed you into discipline. You see that the uncertainty removed your dependence on what you could control. Everything that felt like loss was actually construction. And once this realization takes place, something shifts permanently. You no longer fear the silence. You no longer resist the process. You no longer interpret difficulty as a sign that something is wrong. You begin to recognize it as part of the structure. And this recognition brings a different kind of strength. Not the kind that is loud or visible, but the kind that is stable. The kind that does not fluctuate with circumstances. The kind that remains even when everything around you continues to change. This is where faith becomes grounded. Not in what you hope will happen, but in what you have already understood. Not in what you feel in the moment, but in what has been formed through every moment that came before. And the most powerful part is this. You realize that you did not lose your faith. You outgrew the version of it that could not carry you any further. And now, what you have is different. It is quieter, but stronger. It is less emotional, but more stable. It does not need constant reassurance, because it has been tested in the absence of it. This is the awakening. Not a sudden change in your circumstances, but a complete shift in how you stand within them. And once you reach this point, there is only one thing left to do, to decide what you are going to do with this new level of understanding. The final call, a silent decision. Now you stand at the threshold. Everything you have experienced, every moment of doubt, every silence, every internal struggle has brought you here. And at this threshold, no one can guide you. No one can make this choice for you. This is no longer about understanding or feeling. This is about deciding. You are being invited to a decision that is quiet but powerful. Not one that requires applause, acknowledgement, or validation from the world. It is internal, personal, immediate. A decision to remain steadfast, not because it is easy, not because it feels safe, but because you recognize that what you are building within cannot be abandoned now. And the paradox is this. The very silence that once terrified you now becomes your ally. The absence that once made you question your worth now provides clarity. You realize that faith is no longer something external to you, something to seek and to feel. It is something you inhabit, something you choose every day, in every moment, regardless of circumstance. This decision does not erase doubt. It does not silence fear. It does not make your struggles disappear, but it transforms them. They become the environment in which your new faith grows stronger, steadier, more resilient. You are no longer reactive. You are deliberate. You are intentional. You are aligned with something that cannot be shaken by what is happening around you. And this is why most people never reach this point. They look for external proof, emotional reassurance, immediate clarity. They want their path illuminated before they commit. But true faith is forged when nothing confirms it. True faith is chosen in the absence of everything that makes it comfortable. True faith is a silent declaration that you will continue no matter what. And now, you are in that place. You can turn back to what was familiar, to what felt safe, to what felt understandable. Or you can step forward, quietly, deliberately, with the knowledge that you are being transformed, even when you cannot yet see the full picture. This is the decision that defines everything that comes after. Not the moment of feeling, not the moment of understanding, but the moment of choosing. A silent commitment that resonates in your actions, your thoughts, and your very presence. And once you make this choice, there is no turning back. You have stepped into a version of yourself that cannot be undone by circumstances. You have claimed a faith that is independent of external validation, robust against doubt, resilient against the trials that remain. You have chosen to stand firm, even in the silence, even in the uncertainty, even in the difficulty. And that choice, made quietly, deliberately, becomes your foundation. It is the decision that everything else is built upon. It is the ultimate expression of the internal work you have done. It is the final act that turns struggle into strength, uncertainty into clarity, and pressure into purpose. This is not the end of the journey. It is the point where the journey becomes yours entirely, where faith is no longer a concept to follow, but a reality you live every day, where silence, struggle, and uncertainty are no longer enemies, but allies in shaping the person you are meant to become. And in that moment, you understand. All that was endured, all that was questioned, all that was doubted, was preparing you for this. Preparing you to choose quietly, deliberately, unshakably. Preparing you to embody a faith that is yours, fully, eternally, and without condition.